Sometimes, the deepest betrayal doesn't come from strangers, it comes from the one you once promised forever to. Marcus lay in the hospital bed, his body numb from the waist down. The metallic scent of antiseptic clung to the air, and the soft beeping of machines was the only rhythm keeping time in that cold, fluorescent-lit room. Just 2 weeks ago, he was the top executive of a global logistics company, respected, wealthy, and in his mind deeply loved by his wife, Danielle. Now, he was unemployed, paralyzed from a car accident caused by a drunk driver, and facing a reality that felt more surreal than the crash itself. Danielle sat beside him, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyes strangely distant. At first he thought it was shock, the kind that makes people retreat into themselves. But then, she spoke. "Marcus," she said, her voice flat, "I can do this. I didn't sign up for this life. You can work, you can walk, and I not going to spend the rest of my years taking care of a cripple." She stood, her heels clicking against the tile, and walked out without a hug, without even looking back. The nurse came in moments later with paperwork, divorce papers that had been delivered to the hospital. Marcus just stared at the envelope in his lap. The weight of it felt heavier than any injury. He didn't know it yet, but tucked away in a bank account, only he could access, was $100 million, money he had kept quiet about for years, for reasons only he understood. Danielle thought she was leaving a broken man with nothing. She was about to learn how wrong she was. Here sits what that moment teaches us. People often reveal their truest selves when the masks of comfort are stripped away. Adversity doesn't change character, it exposes it, and for Marcus the betrayal wasn't the end of the story, it was the ignition. Before the accident, Marcus was the kind of man people underestimated, at least in the beginning. He grew up in the south side of Chicago, raised by a mother who worked double shifts at a nursing home, and a father who repaired cars out of a cramped garage. They didn't have much, but what they lacked in money, they made up for in discipline, dignity, and an unshakable belief in education. Marcus excelled in school, but the world never let him forget what he looked like. In boardrooms, he was often the only black man in the room, and more than once he caught colleagues assuming he was the driver or the delivery guy rather than the CEO in training. He learned early that in a system built on perception, silence could be a weapon, so while he worked his way up in corporate logistics, he quietly made moves outside the spotlight, acquiring undervalued warehouses, investing in freight tech startups, and building a network so discreet that even his closest colleagues didn't know the scope of his holdings. By his late 40s, Marcus had amassed a hidden personal fortune, $100 million in liquid assets tucked away in trust accounts, real estate, and offshore holdings. He never flaunted it. He believed in having quiet money, the kind that gives you leverage, without inviting envy or attack. Danielle entered his life in his early 40s. She was beautiful, magnetic, and accustomed to a certain lifestyle. At first Marcus admired her ambition. She wanted the best of everything, and he thought he could provide it without losing himself. But as years passed he began to notice the subtle shifts, her growing fixation on status symbols, her impatience when business trips ran long, her irritation whenever life wasn't smooth. Still he stayed. He told himself love was about compromise, and maybe he could bring out the grounded side of her. What he didn't see, or maybe refused to see, was that Danielle was never in love with his essence. She was in love with the ease his life could give her. And then the accident stripped away that ease. When Marcus lost his ability to walk, he also lost the visible signs of power. Danielle valued the corner office, the corporate jet, the calendar full of galas. In her eyes he went from an asset to a liability. She didn't know it yet, but the man she had just walked away from still had the means to outthink, outlast, and outmaneuver her. Here sits what this part of the story teaches us. Sometimes the root cause of a betrayal isn't the moment of crisis. It's the years of misaligned values that came before it. When one person builds on integrity and the other builds on image, the cracks are inevitable. And now, Marcus was standing at a moral fork in the road. The day after Danielle left, Marcus sat by the window of his rehabilitation room, staring at the drizzle streaking down the glass. His body was confined to a wheelchair, but his mind was running 100 miles an hour. The divorce papers were still unopened on his lap. The easy choice, the one most people would expect, was to fight her in court, to expose the truth about her character, to use his resources to make her regret walking out. Another option was to do nothing, to quietly sign the papers, and fade into the background of her life. But Marcus understood something deeper. Reacting in anger rarely builds the outcome you actually want. It might feel satisfying in the moment, but it almost always plays into the other person's expectations. No, Marcus thought, this needed to be something else. Something slower, something surgical. Danielle didn't know about his fortune. She assumed that without his executive position, he was finished. She was already telling friends she deserved better, and hinting at moving in with a wealthy real estate developer she'd met months before the accident. Marcus could have exposed her instantly, but here's what he realized. People reveal more when they think you're powerless. If he stayed silent, she'd show her full hand. If he kept playing the role of the broken man, he could study the moves of not just Danielle, but the people around her who'd cheered her decision. And there was a more personal layer. Marcus didn't just want to win against her. He wanted to win in spite of her. He wanted to rebuild not to prove her wrong, but to prove himself unshaken. So he made the decision, he would let her walk. No fight, no accusations, no mention of the money. From this moment forward, his plan wouldn't be about revenge, it would be about leverage. Here sits what this moment teaches us. When betrayal strips away your pride, the first instinct is often to retaliate, but the greatest power comes from resisting that impulse, and instead designing a response so calculated that your opponent never even sees it coming. Marcus didn't know it yet, but his restraint in this moment was the single action that would flip the entire outcome. And as he quietly played the role of the defeated man, a hidden power was about to surface. 2 weeks into his rehabilitation, Marcus began his mornings with something no one noticed, a thin leather-bound notebook balanced on the edge of his wheelchair tray. To the nurses, it looked like a journal. To Marcus, it was a war map. Inside were columns of names, dates, and assets. The trust accounts in the Cayman Islands, the commercial properties he'd bought under shell companies, the silent stakes in 3 freight tech firms, now valued at hundreds of millions. Every detail of his fortune was laid out with surgical precision. He'd never told Danielle about these holdings for a reason, not just to protect the money, but to protect his freedom. In the corporate world, and even in marriage, financial transparency can become a leash if you put it in the wrong hands. Marcus also had something even more valuable than money. A network. Over decades he had quietly built relationships with people who didn't just owe him favors, they trusted him implicitly. Former colleagues, small business owners, and even a few political figures who had seen his integrity in action. While Danielle was sipping champagne at charity luncheons, Marcus was calling in those favors, but never about her, never about revenge. His questions were about opportunity. "Find me companies in trouble but with potential," he told a former Wall Street friend. "Send me the zoning updates for the West Coast ports," he texted a city planner he'd once mentored. In the evenings, while other patients watched TV, Marcus listened to audiobooks on strategic thinking, Sun Tzu, Robert Greene, even behavioral economics lectures from MIT. He wasn't rebuilding his body yet, but his mind, it was already running at full capacity. Here sits what others missed. Danielle assumed losing his job meant losing his worth, but she didn't understand that Marcus's value had never been tied to a title. It was in his ability to think 3 moves ahead, while everyone else was playing checkers. A month after she left, Marcus quietly transferred $10 million into a high-yield investment vehicle under a private trust. No one but him and his financial advisor, a woman he trusted like family, knew it existed. It was the first chess move, small in the grand scheme of his wealth, but deliberate. Here sets what this moment teaches us. The power you keep invisible is often the most unshakable. When the world thinks you've been disarmed, they stop guarding against you, and that's when you make your most decisive moves. But while Marcus was moving quietly, life outside his hospital walls was preparing a storm that would test his patience to the limit. The first real blow came 3 months after the accident. Marcus had just been discharged from the rehab center and moved into a modest rental apartment downtown, intentionally far from the estate he and Danielle once shared. He wanted quiet, privacy, a place where he could think without being surrounded by memories. One rainy Thursday, he rolled into his old office building, not for work, but for a board meeting he'd been invited to as a courtesy. He still held minority shares in the company, after all. But when he entered the glass lobby, something in the air felt different. The receptionist, a young man who once greeted him with "Good morning, Mr. Hayes," now offered only a distracted nod. 2 executives passed by, whispering to each other, their eyes darting toward his wheelchair before sliding away. Then came the sting. Halfway through the meeting, a junior VP, someone Marcus had mentored, referred to him in the past tense. "When Marcus was running things, we didn't have these supply chain issues," he said, before catching himself and glancing awkwardly across the table. The room went still. Marcus smiled politely, but inside, something twisted. It wasn't just that they had moved on, it was how quickly they'd erased him. As the meeting ended, he overheard another executive joke under his breath, about how Danielle had traded up and was now with a man who actually had both legs. The laughter was quiet, but sharp enough to cut. Marcus wheeled out of that building with his chest tight. For the first time since deciding to play the long game, he felt the raw urge to burn it all down, to cash out, confront Danielle, crush her in court, and make every person who had written him off eat their words. But he knew that was the trap. The system counted on moments like this: humiliation, isolation, the stripping away of dignity, to push people into impulsive moves. In corporate culture, in legal disputes, in relationships, the one who breaks composure first usually loses the leverage. That night, he sat alone in his apartment, staring at the city lights, the weight of the day pressing on his chest. For a brief, dangerous moment, he wondered if maybe Danielle was right, maybe he was done. Here sits what this moment teaches us. Even the strongest strategy will be tested by emotional ambush. The real danger isn't the insult itself, it's the decision you make in the heat of it. Marcus didn't know it yet, but the next 48 hours would deliver the spark that turned his quiet survival into a calculated resurrection. 2 days after that boardroom humiliation, Marcus received a visitor. It wasn't Sid, a lawyer. It wasn't Sid, a former colleague. It was Harold Whitaker, his old economics professor from Howard University. The man who, 25 years earlier, had taught him the concept that had quietly shaped his business career: control the frame, and you control the game. Harold was older now, slower in his walk, but his eyes still carried the same sharpness. Marcus remembered. They spent the first hour talking about nothing: weather, old classmates, basketball. But then Harold leaned forward and said, "I hear Danielle left." Marcus nodded. Harold didn't offer pity. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. It was a printout of an article, a small logistics startup on the brink of collapse. Harold slid it across the table. "You want to feel whole again? Stop thinking about what you lost. Start thinking about what you can buy. Broken things are bargains, Marcus, and the world never stops producing them." It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about money. It was about momentum. Harold knew that rebuilding your confidence often starts with reclaiming your ability to make decisive moves, even small ones, that create ripple effects. That night, Marcus stayed up until dawn reading the company's financials. They were in trouble. Supply chain bottlenecks, cash flow problems, leadership turnover, but the core tech was sound. He saw it instantly. This wasn't a dying company. It was a diamond in the rough. By sunrise, Marcus had called his financial advisor and instructed her to move $2 million from one of his offshore accounts into a discrete acquisition fund. And it wasn't just about that one company. Harold's visit had triggered a mental shift. Marcus would stop thinking of himself as recovering and start operating like a silent architect. Every move from now on would be a brick in a structure no one else could see being built, until it was towering over them. Here sits what this moment teaches us. A single conversation can shift you from survival mode to strategic mode. The right mentor doesn't just give advice, they hand you a lens that changes how you see every obstacle in front of you. Marcus didn't know it yet, but the acquisition he was about to make would be the first domino in a chain reaction that would bring his name and his power back into every room that had erased him. Marcus knew the first rule of the comeback: never announce it. Within a month, the failing logistics startup was his. The acquisition was buried under a maze of shell companies and trusts so dense that even the most determined investigator would see nothing but a fog of legal structures. Publicly, the CEO remained the same. Privately, Marcus was calling every key operational shot. He started small, restructuring the company's debt, renegotiating vendor contracts, and replacing the weakest links in management with people he personally mentored. No press releases, no LinkedIn announcements, just silent, steady improvement. At the same time, Marcus began acquiring other distressed assets: a shipping yard in Baltimore, a software platform that tracked cargo in real time, and a small trucking fleet on the West Coast. Each move was surgical, timed to coincide with market dips so no one suspected a single player was behind it all. Every morning, he spent 3 hours in physical therapy, pushing his body beyond what doctors thought possible. His upper body grew stronger, his stamina sharper. In the afternoons, he worked from his modest apartment, conducting business over encrypted calls and secure servers. Danielle never called, never checked in. Through a mutual friend, Marcus learned she had moved into her new partner's penthouse and was enjoying the life she deserved. Marcus simply nodded when he heard this. She was watching his silence, mistaking it for defeat. That was good. That was the plan. 3 months in, the startup he'd rescued began showing profits for the first time in 2 years. Competitors noticed the rebound, but assumed it was luck or seasonal demand. They had no idea they were watching the first phase of a much larger design. Here sits what this moment teaches us. Real power grows in the dark. The less noise you make during your climb, the more shocking the moment of arrival will be. By the 6th month, Marcus controlled a quiet but formidable chain of logistics and freight tech companies spanning both coasts, and still, no one outside his circle knew he was the one connecting the dots. But his silence wouldn't last forever. the stage was already being set for a moment that would pull him back into the public eye. A high-stakes deal, where Danielle's new world and Marcus's rebuilt empire would collide head-on. It happened on a Thursday morning in early autumn. Marcus was finalizing the purchase of a prime waterfront property, a shipping hub that would give his growing network unprecedented control over cargo routes along the eastern seaboard. The deal was worth $80 million. The seller? A consortium of investors, led by none other than Danielle's new partner, Richard Halston. Halston was a man who thrived on public displays of dominance. He'd invited press to the signing, expecting to broadcast his strategic win over a competitor he believed to be weak. Cameras were already set up, journalists mingling over catered hors d'oeuvres. When Marcus rolled into the boardroom, Halston's smile faltered for just a second before he recovered. Danielle, seated beside him in a sleek black dress, blinked, the kind of blink you give when your brain can't process what your eyes are seeing. Halston leaned back. "Marcus, didn't expect to see you here. This is a private transaction." Marcus Sefsta's voice was calm, measured. "It is. And as of 20 minutes ago, it sits mine." The room went silent. Halston looked toward the lead broker, who slid a folder across the table. The signed purchase agreement, notarized and complete. Marcus had outbid Halston's consortium in cash, closing the deal before the meeting even began. A reporter, sensing the tension, asked the obvious. "Mr. Hayes, are you saying you now control this port?" Marcus allowed the faintest smile. "I control the flow that runs through it. That's what matters." Danielle's face flushed, part shock, part something else. She'd left believing Marcus was a crippled man with nothing. Now in front of cameras, she was realizing he was the owner of an asset that would dictate her partner's entire supply chain. Here sits what this moment teaches us. The most devastating victories aren't loud confrontations, they're quiet moves that corner your opponent before they even know they're playing the game. As reporters swarmed for questions, Marcus simply signed the final documents, nodded to the room, and left. No gloating, no theatrics, just the knowledge that the power balance had shifted completely. But in the days that followed, this single move would ripple outward, dismantling alliances, exposing loyalties, and forcing Danielle to confront a truth she could no longer ignore. The fallout was immediate. Within a week of Marcus acquiring the port, Halston's shipping contracts began to strain. Routes that had been predictable for years were suddenly subject to new negotiations. Fees shifted, timelines tightened. Competitors, some quietly backed by Marcus, began undercutting Halston's bids. Danielle, used to champagne brunches and weekend getaways, began noticing the subtle changes. Halston Sepp's phone calls growing longer and tenser, his smile tightening at public events, the occasional muttered curse about that damn port deal. Then the media caught wind of the deeper story. Investigative reporters pieced together Marcus's silent acquisitions over the past year. What emerged wasn't just a man recovering from tragedy. It was a man who had quietly built one of the most efficient, tech-integrated logistics networks in the country. Articles labeled him the invisible architect. For Danielle, the humiliation was sharper than the day she walked out of that hospital room. She had told friends Marcus was finished. Now those same friends were sending her links to glowing profiles of him, features that praised his foresight, his resilience, and his refusal to publicly smear anyone, even those who had wronged him. And Marcus? He never once mentioned her name in an interview. That silence cut deeper than any insult could have. But the victory wasn't just personal. By acquiring and revitalizing struggling logistics companies, Marcus had reopened hundreds of jobs in communities where work had dried up. Former employees, some who'd once underestimated him, now spoke of his integrity with genuine respect. Here sits what this moment teaches us. Redemption isn't about proving your worth to those who doubted you, it's about using your comeback to create a reality so undeniable that their opinions become irrelevant. Halston's empire began to wobble. Danielle quietly moved out of the penthouse. Rumor had it, she tried to reach Marcus. A text here, a call there, but he never responded. Not out of spite, but because that chapter was already closed. What mattered now wasn't what he'd lost, but the legacy he was building. And that legacy was about to take an even larger shape. A year after the port acquisition, Marcus sat in his office overlooking the docks. From this vantage point, he could see the quiet choreography of cranes, trucks, and cargo ships, a network that now answered to him. The air smelled faintly of salt and diesel, and in the distance, the city skyline glowed against the evening sky. It wasn't just about the money anymore, it never had been. When Marcus reflected on everything, the accident, the divorce, the humiliation, he didn't see them as separate events. He saw them as a single refining fire, a trial designed not to destroy him, but to strip away every illusion until all that remained was truth. Danielle had been a part of that truth. Her leaving had been the final proof that some bonds are built on conditions, not commitment. And once those conditions are gone, so is the loyalty. Marcus had learned that the real measure of power isn't what you can show the world, it's what you can build when the world thinks you have nothing left. He turned back to his desk, where a letter from a community leader sat unopened. It was a thank you note for funding a job training program for displaced dock workers, men and women who now had stable employment because of the companies Marcus had revived. He smiled, not for recognition, but because this was the victory, not the headlines, not the reversal in the boardroom, but the quiet knowledge that his climb back had lifted others with him. Here sits what this entire journey teaches us. Adversity will strip away the people and possessions you thought defined you. Let it, because what's left, the resilience, the discipline, the vision, is the foundation of a life no betrayal can break. And when you find yourself betrayed, you have two choices. React in anger, or respond with strategy. One burns quick, the other builds forever. Marcus chose the second path, and in doing so he didn't just reclaim his life, he rewrote its terms. So here's my challenge to you. When life takes something from you, don't rush to take something back. Sit still, see the board, and then move. Not for revenge, but for the legacy you want to leave. If this story resonated with your values, like, comment, and subscribe, because every story we tell here is a reminder. The game isn't over when you're down, it's over when you stop thinking 3 moves ahead.